A recent report for USA Today says Massachusetts has the largest economic divide between Latinos and whites. The ranking also reflected data for education, unemployment, and incarceration. To talk about the report is the executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Economic Justice, Iván Espinoza-Madrigal. Thank you very much for being with us again, Iván.
Thank you for inviting me, Chris.
First of all, this ranking sounds a little counterintuitive. This is a state with such a strong economy and good schools. So, I mean, why does it look that bad for Latinos?
Yeah, I think it's exactly these type of reports that highlight the need for us to be very deliberate and intentional about our educational programs, our economic initiatives, to make sure that they are resonating in the heart of Latino and other minority communities. Because you're right, Chris, in a state with a robust economy, with rich educational opportunities, it's reports like this that remind us that not everyone has access to those privileges.
Now, of course, the other thing I ask myself, is this just another example of a state maybe that has a more recent immigrant population, and there's this old, pattern in American history. A lot of immigrants, they come here poor. It takes them a while to move up. Mm-hmm. Does that account for part of this, you think, maybe?
In part, it does, even though there are some Latino communities that have been present in Massachusetts for a long time. If you look, for example, at the Puerto Rican community, Puerto Ricans have been a part of the social fabric of our Commonwealth for a long time, and not just in Boston, going back to the 60s and 50s, but also in other communities, Springfield, Worcester. And so there are some Latino communities that have been present here for a long time, and even within those communities, the indicators are bad, right? They show lower educational attainment, poorer housing and economic opportunities. And then when we look at more recent Latino communities and more recent immigrant communities, as you're suggesting, Chris, we also track very similar failure to provide economic opportunities and to really lift all boats as the economy and other opportunities are expanding in Massachusetts. So there could be a component of this, because it's a complex constellation of factors that are causing these poorer, more negative outcomes. So a part of that constellation of factors could be recent immigration trends, but I would say that even with Puerto Rican communities that have been here for generations, we still find some of these weaker performances that I think speak to the systemic barriers that are faced by these families and by these communities.
Well, speaking of systemic things, I'm sure you saw the report last year by the Greater Boston Latino Network, and they looked at representation in positions of power, key positions in government, for example. Latinos are almost 19% of the population in Boston, so compare that to where they are in these key positions.
Absolutely, and thank you for flagging that. The Greater Boston Latino Network report is a really powerful tool that shows the extent of the marginalization, and I think a better term would even be the invisibility of the Latino community. Even though the demographic trends are undeniable, we have, as you just suggested, basically 1 out of every 5 Bostonians now identifying as Latino. Even more drastic is the growth in Latino students within the public school system. 42% of the public school students in Boston are Latino, compared to 35% who are African American. So as you could see, we are talking about a very large Latino population, whether it's adult population or even children. And at the same time, there is significant exclusion and invisibility in the halls of power. And I'm not just talking about City Hall, which is an important place to start, but I'm also talking about the private sector, because ultimately it's representation in the public sector and the private sector that in tandem will be able to lift all boats. And right now, we don't see a lot of people who look like me, who are Latino, who are from the communities that are most affected in positions of power. And I feel that that is something that we in particular have been doing a really poor job in compared to other cities and other states. And that explains why the ranking for Massachusetts is really dead last compared to other states and cities. I don't think we're deliberate and intentional enough about the outreach and inclusion for the Latino community.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with Iván Espinoza-Madrigal from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Economic Justice. Talk about the channels of power or into power. I mean, what's missing? I mean, the institutional assets. Talk about that.
Absolutely, Chris. The institutional assets are key to make sure that the community is stabilized and making advancement and progress. In other cities, for example, in New York, you have the Hispanic Federation. In Philadelphia, you have the Congreso de Latinos Unidos. And that's just here in the Northeast, let alone in the West Coast and in other regions. Here in Boston, we have a limited number of Latino-serving nonprofits, and most of them focused, for example, like Sociedad Latina, doing excellent work with youth, or Hyde Square Task Force that is also working with youth, and other service providers like the EBEC in East Boston, which is working with the immigrant population, and also IBA, Inquilinos Boricuas en Acción,
Villa Victoria.
in Villa Victoria in the South End. So we do have some institutional assets that are very powerful on the ground. At the same time, we don't have an entity like Congreso Latino or like the Hispanic Federation here. And the closest thing to that was an organization called OISTE, which closed its doors a few years ago. And in the absence of OISTE, we have no civic engagement or advocacy group that is functioning at the state level. Nobody who's interfacing between the halls of power and the Latino community. And so the absence of groups like OISTE mean that we have a compromised infrastructure within the Latino community. And I think that helps explain why some of the indicators are dead last compared to other cities and states around the country. We need more Latino infrastructure to be able to advance the agenda that helps lift these families out of poverty and into opportunities, and that help close those opportunity gaps. And we just don't have that as a city or as a state.
I do have to ask you about one other challenge here, and that is the clouded status for some of the more recent immigrants. And going back the last decade plus, that has to have some effect on their upward mobility, their opportunities to even assimilate. Talk about how that plays into the divide.
Well, clearly, we are also talking about a community that faces language barriers, that faces immigration status barriers, and these barriers can be significant hurdles for Latino empowerment and upward mobility. And so those are certainly factors that we need to take into account. And frankly, I feel that what that means is that we need to make sure that we are, as a state, as a city, as a private sector, as a nonprofit sector, that we are all working collectively to make sure that we are helping to close those opportunity gaps, whether it is making sure that resources are linguistically available to these families, available in a culturally competent manner, and that we are also protecting these families from the brunt of immigration enforcement. It is critical for us to have strong immigrant-friendly policies on the ground. That's what allows victims and witnesses of crime to come and talk to law enforcement. It's what allows families to be able to send their children to school knowing that they're going to be welcome and safe.
I know there have been strong assurances from the Boston Public Schools and the mayor about making sure that kids from families where there's a problem with status don't get into trouble, at least on their watch. But there was one student in the Boston schools got involved in, I guess, a minor incident, and somehow that went up to a police agency, and it went on from there. Explain why you're concerned about that.
Absolutely. At the Lawyers Committee, we've been monitoring and working closely with other partners on the ground in connection with this incident involving a high school student at the East Boston High School who was involved in a minor alteration in school. It was even reported by school officials as an attempted incident to start a fight that was unsuccessful. It was, as is always wonderful to see, properly mediated and de-escalated by school officials. And at the same time, even though that incident went away, the report of that incident is still around, and it's not only around, but it ended up in a regional fusion center, one of the law enforcement intelligence centers, the BRIC Center, which is basically a place that collects police reports and other data and makes them available to federal officials. ICE officials, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, were able to access this school record, which pertains to a high school student that wasn't involved in any type of dangerous activity. We're not talking about bringing weapons or drugs into school. It was a minor incident that didn't even come to pass, and somehow this record is found in a law enforcement center and accessed by immigration officials, placing this student on a school to deportation pipeline. And this is important because this is exactly the type of destabilizing effect that policies that don't properly protect our communities can have. And that sends a chilling effect deep into the community. It sends a signal that families are not being protected, that families are not really meaningfully integrated, whether it's in the school community or in the city at large or in the state. And so it's critical that as we engage in policy making, that as we engage in hiring practices, that as we create opportunities for advancement, that we are taking into account these type of experiences and come out in front of them by adopting policies that are radically inclusive and that are deliberately and intentionally protecting Latinos and other immigrants.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Iván Espinoza-Madrigal from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Economic Justice.